Recently, I bought the Homage to the Serica 5303, and I had a whole bunch of reasons why I chose the Homage over the original. I put a lot of time and energy into making that decision, but I'm still not quite sure if I made the right decision. But right now, I've been able to borrow the actual Serica 5303, and I'm able to now put them side by side, and I can try and answer that question. Did I buy the right one, or should I have bought the original? Hello, you're watching James. My name's James, you're watching me, and I'm talking about watches. And today, I'm putting two amazing watches side by side. The Serica 5303 and its Homage, the Ipose 5303. Now, I know a few people have mentioned that perhaps it isn't a Homage, it's perhaps a very much of a replica. I personally don't think so. I think it is a Homage. It just doesn't have a certain logo on the dial, so people are thinking, oh, it looks very similar. But in reality, side by side, they're actually quite different. They're quite different in a few ways, which I'm really interested in sharing with you. But what I really want to do today is answer a question for myself. Did I make the right decision buying the Homage, or should I have bought the original watch? Now, there is a number of reasons why I chose to buy the Homage over the original. Money is normally the reason why you buy a Homage over the original, and that was one of the factors, but it wasn't the only factor, and it wasn't even the main factor. So I'm really keen to put these watches side by side, show you the similarities, the differences, and the differences in what you get for your money, and answer that question, did I make the right choice? Now, this Serica 5303 is not my watch. I have borrowed it. I borrowed it from Jason from Houtman Watches. He has been nice enough to support me again by lending me one of his personal watches. If you're interested in Houtman Watches, which you should be because they're one of my favorite microbrands, I'll leave a link to his website down below. But let's flip the camera around now and let's put these two watches side by side. So I have to say it is very cool to be able to have both of these watches in hand and have them side by side to see the differences and similarities of them, and also to see whether my purchase of this watch, the Homage to the Serica, was the correct choice. So I want to point out some of the similarities, the differences, the positives and negatives of both, and then circle around to that question about, did I buy the correct watch? And the first thing I want to do is talk about the dimensions of the watch because, well, that is the first thing, and one of the big reasons why I chose the Homage, because on paper it is a little bit bigger. In reality, the Serica is 38.8 millimeters, the Ipose is 40 millimeters. The thicknesses of the watches, the Serica is 12.3 millimeters, the Ipose is 12.5 millimeters. The lug to lug of the Serica is 46.2 millimeters. The Ipose is 47.7 millimeters. That's really probably the biggest dimension difference between the two. Both of them have 20 millimeter lug widths, and the weights are virtually the same. The Serica being 114 grams versus the Ipose being 112 grams. But in person, those dimensions are not really the things that stand out most about the sizing of the watches, because they actually do feel very similar in size. But there's something about the size of them that is different, and that is the dial size. Check out the differences in the sizes of the dials. Can you see it? I'm not sure if the film is going to show it or the video is going to show it, but the dial size of the Serica is significantly smaller than the dial size of the Ipose, and that makes a significant difference between the two watches. The dial size of the Serica is 26 millimeters or thereabouts. It's a little bit harder to measure that sort of measurement, whereas the dial size of the Ipose is 29 millimeters. That's a whole 3 millimeters difference. This is a fairly much more standard size of dial. I've been comparing it against some other watches in my collection that have this sort of size of case. This is sort of fairly standard. Hence why the Serica's dial, the slightly smaller dial, stands out as something a little bit different. Now, I'm not saying that as a negative. I just want to point it out because this is not something that I noticed when I was comparing these watches online and trying to make the decision between buying the original Serica or buying the Homage Ipose. Now, where is that extra 3 millimeters made up? Well, it's a mixture between a few things. There seems to be a little bit more of a gap between the edge of the bezel and the start of the bezel itself. The bezel itself is a little bit thinner as well, and the grip does tend to stick out a touch more compared to the Homage. So between those three factors, that's probably where that 3 millimeters is. The next dimension that sort of stands out, and you can sort of see quite quickly, is how different the crowns are. Yep, the Ipose is wider and longer. It is a 7.8 millimeter crown by 3 millimeters versus 7.3 millimeters by 2 millimeters. This has a much more sort of vintage style feel to it. whereas this probably has a little bit more of a modern sort of feel to it. Again, I'm not sure which one I actually prefer. It's just something that does stand out. The only other dimension that really is significantly different is when you look at these transitions, this part here is wider or comes onto this strap more than this one. Not too much of a big sort of visual difference there, but it is something that stands out when you have two watches in hand. Now, when we sort of focus now in on the dials, besides the obvious differences, there's only sort of one thing that really stands out to me as different. Okay, yes, black versus white. Yes, date winded versus no date window. Let's put that aside. What is different is the lume application. The lume color on this one here is a more sort of a slightly vintage photinery kind of look lume, whereas the lume on this one has more of that sort of greeny yellow look to it. Both are applied really well, both look really good. They're just a difference between the two. Both, however, are both sort of very legible as well. The black on the white and the white on the black. There is a slight difference with the hands, however, and I'm not sure if the Serica is like this when you go between the two colors, but I can certainly say that the white on the hands here is like a polished or a sort of shiny surface, whereas the black on the Ipose is more of a sort of a matte finish. Checking out the lume on both of the watches, it's both really good. Both of them have excellent lume. Talking about lume, however, there's a difference between the lume pips here, and there's quite a big difference. The lume pip on the Serica is sort of set into the bezel, which I really like. I think it looks much more flush, a little bit more neat, whereas the lume pip on the Ipose is sort of set up and it has its own little silver surround, so it stands out a little bit more. A real sort of different point between the two watches. Something else that stands out between the two watches is the bezel action. The bezel action on the Serica is gorgeous. It's soft and smooth, and it really has a very much luxury watch feel to it. Bezel action on the Ipose is really good, but it has a much more firm feeling, much more clickier feeling. It feels great. It's just when you compare it against the original watch that you notice a significant difference. What I will say about the bezel action though, however, between the two, having now had both in hand, the Serica is more likely to be knocked and moved, whereas the Ipose, you can sort of knock it and it does not move off where you've set it. The bezel inserts themselves are really good and probably very similar. The Serica is probably a touch better if you look really, really closely in regards to the finishing, but realistically, I'd say they're very similar. Very similar sort of coin-edged bezel to them as well. Now, obviously the cases look very similar, same design, same transition between brushing, polishing, brushing, brushing, polishing, brushing, but there is a bit of a clear difference. You do notice that the brushing is better on the Serica, especially along the side of the watch, and you do notice the transition between brushing and polishing is better on the Serica, which is not unexpected whatsoever. I'll try and get a bit of a close-up there to show you. You can see the Ipose is actually still very good, but the Serica is just that next level good. Now, I've already spoken about those lug transitions or those solid end lugs there. Both are really good. The Serica is a little bit better. It's a little bit smaller. It is a little bit better refined. It is smoother and it sort of moves a little bit nicer. I have noticed on occasion when I put my watch on that this tends to maybe grab a little bit up. I then have to push it and then it sits down and then I don't have any further issues with it. But it does occasionally, just initially when on rest, sit like this until I actually push it down. I've not had that issue with the Serica at all. It definitely feels a little bit smoother, a little bit more refined. It just sort of falls into place perfectly every time. Now, there are some differences between the mesh straps as well. I'm not going to say one is better than the other. There is just some differences. You can see when we sort of zoom in there, the Serica on the left, it is a little bit more pushed down or a little bit more flat, whereas the Ipose on the right is a little bit more sort of, I guess, rough. Both feel very good, but you notice there is a much smoother sort of feel to the Serica. I don't think one is better than the other specifically. It's just that they are different. Both of them taper down a little bit, but both of them have a slightly different end. You'll see the Serica has a sort of pushed down sort of end there, sort of melded into itself, whereas the Ipose actually has a little end cap on there. The clasps are pretty much exactly the same and work exactly the same. It's just that the Serica is unbranded, whereas the Ipose has a brand on it. Case backs are both fairly simple. I have to say though, the Ipose actually has probably a more interesting looking case back or a little bit neater looking case back, especially because it has that nice sort of logo in the center, but both fairly simple, both fairly fine. Now, one of the biggest differences between these watches is the movements that are used. And it's one of the reasons why I end up choosing the Ipose versus the original. The original has a Newton Swiss movement in there. It has no ghost position, has no date. It has a few inherent sort of characteristics which may be a little bit interesting, versus this one here has the Serica SW200 with a date complication, and they've actually put the date complication on the dial as well rather than having a ghost position. Now, I think both movements are good. However, I think the sort of known quantity of the Serica movement is something that pushed me over towards this one. I have noticed when I do wind this watch occasionally, it has an interesting sort of almost a vintage feel to it, like a little clicking feel, whereas the Serica is very sort of known. It has that sort of a slightly gritty feel, which is very sort of known to the ETA and Serica movements. The hacking doesn't always work perfectly on the Serica, whereas the hacking always works perfectly on the Ipose. And on wrist, I have to say, they both sit very, very, very well. There is not really that much of a difference in between the actual overall case sizes of these watches. So having it on wrist, you really don't notice a huge difference between the overall dimensions. What you do notice though, as I've mentioned, is the dial size. This one really feels sort of more traditional and normal, whereas the Serica, it feels different, smaller. Not a bad thing, just something that is definitely worth mentioning. So which watch is better, and did I make the right decision buying the Homage versus the original? Well, let's just consider the main points. The Serica is around about 4 times the price of the Ipose. The movement, I actually prefer probably inside the Ipose versus the original, but the original is definitely better quality, better finished. You notice the differences slightly in the brushing, definitely in the case brushing, the transition there. It does have a slightly nicer feeling sort of mesh there, albeit I like this one as well. So you can notice that there is definitely a difference in quality, but it's only by a small fraction. And there's small fractions all over the place, a little bit here, a little bit there. Overall, the Homage has done an incredible job to look and feel almost as good. From a size perspective, the two big things that stand out is the dial sizes and the crown sizes. And when I start putting those things together, I think I've actually made the right decision. I do really like the Serica. It is lovely. It is a nice watch, but when you put together the price, the size, the dial size, the crown size, the movement, I actually prefer the Homage. So I'm very glad that I made the right decision. I don't think you can make too bad a decision between these two. If you're going to buy one over the other, they are both beautiful watches. They are both nice. They're both cool to have in the collection. But I'm glad I actually end up going with the Homage. And guys, if you enjoyed this video, maybe check these ones out next.